Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we open another file, examining the intricate details of a case shrouded in silence. In a small town, a secret is a heavy burden. But what happens when that secret is murder, and the burden is shared by almost everyone? We will be exploring a case where an entire community was bound by a chilling, silent understanding of death that remained officially unsolved, yet unofficially, the killer's identity was common knowledge. This is the story of the powerful forces that can turn neighbors into keepers of a town's darkest secret. Case 1. The unspoken verdict in Skidmore. The town's collective response to an untouchable, decades-long bully. The story of Skidmore, Missouri, is not a story about a single act of violence. It is a story about the slow, corrosive effect of fear, the failure of a system designed to protect, and the desperate measures a community will take when it feels abandoned. It is a chronicle of a cancer that grew for decades in the heart of a small farming town, a malignancy named Kenneth Rex McElroy. To understand what happened on the scorching hot morning of July 10th, 1981, one must first understand the man who was its cause. Ken McElroy was not an outsider. He was born and raised in the rural expanse of Nottoway County, a landscape of rolling hills and endless fields of corn and soy. In such places, reputations are forged over generations, and the McElroy name carried with it a legacy of poverty, illiteracy, and a simmering, violent resentment toward the world. Ken was the 10th of 16 children, and from a young age, he learned that the world responded not to reason or decency, but to brute force and intimidation. He was a large, imposing man, rarely seen without a firearm within easy reach. He dropped out of school in the 8th grade, functionally illiterate, but he possessed a cunning and a predatory instinct that served him far better than any formal education could have in his chosen profession, being a menace. His criminal record was a testament to a life lived outside the law. It began with petty theft and cattle rustling stealing from the very farmers who were his neighbors and escalated over the years into a litany of more serious offenses: arson, assault, child molestation, and statutory rape. By the 1970s, McElroy was not just a criminal. He was an institution of terror in Skidmore, a town of just over 400 people. He operated with a sense of absolute impunity. His method was simple and brutally effective. He would commit a crime in broad daylight, often in front of witnesses. When charges were brought, he would hire the best defense attorney in the region, Richard Gene McFadden, a lawyer whose skill in the courtroom was matched only by McElroy's skill in the barnyard. McFadden was adept at exploiting legal technicalities, requesting changes of venue, and delaying trials until memories faded. But McElroy's most powerful weapon was witness intimidation. Potential witnesses would receive late-night phone calls. Their property would be vandalized, their livestock harmed, their children threatened on the way to school. The message was clear. Testifying against Ken McElroy would bring a world of pain upon you and your family, a pain the legal system was powerless to prevent. And so, time and again, witnesses would recant their stories, fail to appear in court, or suddenly develop amnesia on the stand. Charges were dropped. Juries acquitted. McElroy would walk out of the courthouse, a smirk on his face, and return to Skidmore to resume his reign. He had been indicted 21 times. He had been convicted only once, a minor assault charge for which he served no time. To the people of Skidmore, the law was a shield that protected the predator, not the prey. The town lived under a suffocating blanket of fear. Parents warned their children to come straight home from school. Farmers double-checked the locks on their gates and barns. The sight of McElroy's dusty pickup truck rolling slowly down Main Street was enough to send people scurrying indoors. He was a ghost who haunted the living, a constant, oppressive presence that warped the fabric of daily life into a state of perpetual anxiety. The breaking point began to form in the late 1970s, and it centered around a 70-year-old grocer named Ernest Bowenkamp and his wife, Lois. The Bowenkamps were respected members of the community, the kind of hardworking, church-going people who formed the backbone of a town like Skidmore. Their conflict with McElroy started over a trivial matter. McElroy's daughter had allegedly stolen a piece of candy from their small grocery store. Lois Bowenkamp spoke to the child, and in McElroy's world, that was an unforgivable offense. His campaign of harassment against the elderly couple began. He would park his truck outside their store for hours, glaring at them, his shotgun visible on the seat beside him. He would follow them, tailgate them, whisper threats. The Bowenkamps, like so many others, went to the authorities. They filed reports. They pleaded for help. But the response was always the same. Without a direct, overt act of violence that could be proven in court, there was little that could be done. McElroy was an expert at psychological warfare, at living in the gray area of the law. The situation festered until the summer of 1980. McElroy accused Bowenkamp of a ridiculous offense, being a pedophile who had been molesting his daughters. This was his standard tactic, projecting his own sins onto his victims. On the evening of July 27, 1980, the conflict came to a head. Bowenkamp was sitting on the loading dock behind his store when McElroy drove up, accompanied by his young wife, Trina. McElroy got out of his truck, a shotgun in his hand, and confronted the old man. Words were exchanged. McElroy claimed Bowenkamp reached for a weapon, a claim no one else substantiated. Then, a blast from McElroy's shotgun tore through the quiet evening air. Bowenkamp was hit in the neck. He collapsed, bleeding profusely, but miraculously, he survived. The town was stunned. This was no longer just intimidation. This was attempted murder, committed in cold blood against a defenseless old man. Surely this time the system would work. McElroy was arrested, charged, and for once, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Bowenkamp was a living, breathing victim who could identify his shooter. At his trial, McElroy's attorney, McFadden, worked his usual magic. He argued self-defense, painting the 70-year-old, 145-pound grocer as a credible threat to the burly, armed McElroy. The trial ended in a conviction for second-degree assault. The town of Skidmore held its breath, waiting for the sentence, praying that their tormentor would finally be locked away. The judge sentenced him to the maximum, 2 years in prison. It was not enough, but it was something. It was a reprieve. But their relief was short-lived. McFadden immediately filed an appeal and requested that McElroy be released on bond pending the outcome. To the absolute horror and disbelief of the entire community, the judge granted it. Ken Rex McElroy, a man just convicted of shooting an elderly man in the neck, was free to return to Skidmore. This was the moment the fragile bond of trust between the town and the legal system finally shattered. The message received by the people of Skidmore was devastatingly clear. The law could not, or would not, protect them. They were on their own. McElroy's return was not triumphant. It was terrifying. He was more brazen than ever. He began carrying a rifle with him openly, telling people it was for the mad dogs in town. He resumed his harassment of the Bowenkamps, making their lives a living hell. He would later be accused of castrating a dog belonging to one of his accusers and leaving the remains on their porch. The terror had not ended. It had intensified. Another man, Romaine Henry, a farmer in his 60s, also found himself in McElroy's crosshairs. McElroy had been poaching deer on Henry's land. When Henry's son confronted him, McElroy threatened him. The fear for his family's safety led Romain Henry to purchase a high-powered rifle and sleep with it by his bed. He was not an aggressive man, but he had been pushed to the point where he felt he had no choice but to be prepared to defend his home. The collective anxiety in Skidmore reached a fever pitch. A town meeting was called at the American Legion Hall on Main Street. It was an unofficial gathering, a desperate conference of frightened citizens. Nearly every man in town was there. They spoke of their fear, their frustration, their utter helplessness. They discussed the McElroy problem from every angle. They talked about petitioning the governor, about seeking federal intervention. Nottoway County Sheriff Danny Estes was present. His words offered no comfort. He admitted, frankly, that his small department was outmatched. He couldn't provide 24-hour protection for every family McElroy had threatened. He essentially told them, "I can't protect you." The meeting ended without a formal plan, but a new, unspoken understanding had settled over the men. The air was thick with it. If the law would not remove the cancer, they would have to cut it out themselves. It was not a conspiracy hatched in whispers, but a consensus born of shared desperation. The morning of July 10th, 1981, dawned hot and humid. Ken McElroy and his wife, Trenna, who was only 20 at the time and the mother of one of his children, drove into town in a silver and gray Chevrolet Silverado. McElroy had been drinking. They went to the D&G Tavern on Main Street. He sat at the bar, drank beer, and made his presence known, a menacing specter in the dim light of the bar. Outside, word of his presence spread like wildfire. A crowd began to gather. It was not a lynch mob in the traditional sense, whipped into a frenzy with torches and pitchforks. It was quiet, somber, and deliberate. Men, many of whom had been at the town meeting, began to assemble on the street. Some reports say between 30 and 60 people were there. They were farmers, business owners, and laborers. They were fathers and husbands. They stood in the oppressive summer heat, watching, waiting. The air was thick with a tension that was almost physical. Inside the tavern, McElroy became agitated by the growing crowd. He finished his drinks, paid his tab, and walked out, Trenna by his side. He saw the silent wall of men. He reportedly made a few threatening remarks, but for once, his words had no effect. The men just stared, their faces grim, unreadable. McElroy and Trenna got into his truck. He placed a rifle on the seat, started the engine, and put a cigarette in his mouth. In that moment, before he could put the truck in gear, 2 shots rang out, almost simultaneously. The sound echoed down Main Street, sharp and final. One bullet, fired from a high-powered rifle, struck McElroy in the head. Another from a shotgun hit him in the neck. The cigarette fell from his lips. He slumped over the steering wheel, killed instantly. Trenna's screams pierced the sudden, profound silence. She scrambled from the truck, hysterical, crying that they had killed her husband. But no one moved to help. No one ran. The crowd simply stood for a moment, a silent tableau under the harsh midday sun, and then, as if by a silent, prearranged signal, they began to disperse. They melted back into the town, back to their farms, back to their homes. Within minutes, Sheriff Danny Estes arrived. The scene was surreal. A man lay dead in his truck in the middle of Main Street, his wife screaming beside him, and the street was nearly empty. When the investigation began, law enforcement ran into a wall of silence more solid than any brick building. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. Men who had been standing mere feet from the shooting claimed they were looking the other way, or that the sun was in their eyes, or that they had simply heard a loud noise and didn't know where it came from. The entire town was a suspect, and the entire town was an alibi. Trenna McElroy was the only witness willing to talk. She identified a man named Del Clement, farmer, as one of the shooters. She claimed he was the one who fired the rifle. But her testimony was problematic. In the chaos and terror of the moment, her memory was questioned. Furthermore, the town closed ranks against her. She was the wife of their tormentor, an outsider who had been part of the machine of their oppression. Her credibility was systematically dismantled by the community's collective will. The investigation, led by state and federal authorities, was extensive. The FBI was called in. A grand jury was convened. Dozens of townspeople were subpoenaed to testify. They all marched in one by one and told the same story. They saw nothing. The social pressure to remain silent was immense. To speak would be to betray not just a neighbor, but the entire community. It would mean branding oneself a traitor to the unspoken pact that had brought them their first night of peaceful sleep in years. Del Clement, the man Trenna named, was arrested. But without corroborating evidence, the case against him was weak. The grand jury failed to return an indictment. They tried again with a new grand jury. The result was the same. No one was ever charged with the murder of Ken Rex McElroy. The case remains, to this day, officially unsolved. The story of Skidmore became a national sensation. It was featured on 60 Minutes and in magazines across the country. The town was portrayed as a lawless outpost of vigilante justice, a throwback to the Old West. But to the people of Skidmore, it was not that simple. They did not see themselves as murderers. They saw themselves as survivors. They saw the shooting not as an act of aggression, but as an act of communal self-defense, a desperate surgery to remove a disease that the doctors of the law had refused to treat. In the years that followed, a fragile peace returned to Skidmore. The fear that had been a constant companion was gone. Children could play outside, without looking over their shoulders. Business owners no longer felt the need to keep a weapon under the counter. The reign of terror, as it was universally called, was over. But the peace came at a cost. The secret of what happened on July 10, 1981, became a permanent part of the town's identity. It is a ghost that lingers, a testament to a time when the law failed and the people took it into their own hands. Was it murder? By the letter of the law, absolutely. Was it justice? That is a far more complicated question, one that the people of Skidmore have lived with for over 40 years. Their silence is their answer. It is the unspoken verdict of a town that believed it had no other choice. The story of Ken Rex McElroy is a chilling reminder that the line between a civilized society and a desperate mob can be terrifyingly thin, and that sometimes the loudest statement a community can make is its collective, unyielding silence. It stands as a profound and disturbing examination of what happens when a community's fear of a single man becomes greater than its fear of the law itself. Case 2. The Beloved Killer of Carthage. A murder hidden not by fear, but by a community's overwhelming affection for the killer. In the annals of true crime, silence is often a shield forged from fear. A community closes ranks to protect itself from a predator or from the consequences of its own violent justice, as was the case in Skidmore. But the story we turn to now is a far stranger and perhaps more unsettling variant of the small-town secret. It is the story of a murder that was hidden not by fear, but by love. It is the story of Carthage, Texas, and how a town's overwhelming affection for a killer allowed him to conceal his crime in plain sight, demonstrating that a community's heart, in its own way, can be as effective an accomplice as its fear. Carthage, nestled in the piney woods of East Texas, is a town built on traditional values: church on Sunday, high school football on Friday, and a deep-seated belief in the importance of neighborliness. It was in this quintessential southern town that Bernhard, Bernie, Tita, too, arrived and flourished. Bernie was not just a resident. He was an institution. He was the assistant funeral director at Hawthorne Funeral Home, a role he performed with a level of compassion and theatrical flair that was legendary. To say Bernie was well-liked would be a profound understatement. He was adored. He was a portly, cherubic man with a beatific smile and a song for every occasion. He sang in the church choir with a voice that could bring tears to the eyes of the most stoic congregant. He taught Sunday school, directed local theater productions, and was an active member of the Chamber of Commerce. If a family was in need, Bernie was the first to organize a bake sale or a fundraiser. He remembered everyone's name, their children's names, and the date of their last bereavement. For the many widows of Carthage, he was a God-sended dapper companion for a lonely dinner, a helping hand with banking, or simply a friendly face with a sympathetic ear. Bernie Tita was the beating, benevolent heart of Carthage. His polar opposite was Marjorie Nugent. Mrs. Nugent was the widow of a wealthy oilman, and she was as reviled in Carthage as Bernie was loved. Where Bernie was open and generous, Marjorie was guarded and famously miserly. Where Bernie was a pillar of the community, Marjorie was a recluse, known for her sharp tongue, her controlling nature, and her general unpleasantness to anyone who had the misfortune of dealing with her, from bank tellers to her own family. She was immensely wealthy, living in a large, stately home, but she was emotionally impoverished, isolated by a personality that pushed everyone away. The paths of these two diametrically opposed figures crossed in 1990 in the most fitting of places, the Hawthorne Funeral Home. Bernie presided over the funeral of Marjorie's husband, R.L. Rod Nugent. He handled the arrangements with his signature grace and empathy. In the lonely days that followed the service, Bernie visited Marjorie, offering comfort. For the first time, perhaps in her entire life, someone was showing the notoriously difficult widow sustained, unconditional kindness. Marjorie, starved for attention, latched onto him. What began as pastoral care soon blossomed into an unlikely and all-consuming friendship. Bernie became Marjorie's constant companion, her business manager, her travel agent, and her sole link to the outside world. She, in turn, lavished her wealth upon him. They took extravagant trips around the world, cruises to the Orient, flights on the Concorde to New York for shopping sprees at Tiffany & Company, jaunts to Paris and Egypt. Bernie was given power of attorney over her vast fortune, estimated to be worth around $10 million. He quit his job at the funeral home to become her full-time employee and companion. To the people of Carthage, this was a beautiful, if odd, story. It was Bernie, in his infinite goodness, saving a lonely old woman from her own miserable solitude. And Bernie, in his new role, became even more generous. He used Mrs. Nugent's money to fund scholarships for local students, to buy new instruments for the high school band, to make significant donations to the church, and to help families who had fallen on hard times. He bought cars and gifts for his friends. He was a veritable Robin Hood, taking from the rich, miserly widow, and giving to the deserving townspeople. No one questioned it too deeply. They saw it as Mrs. Nugent finally, through Bernie's benevolent influence, doing some good with her money. They saw only Bernie's kindness, not the source of the funds that enabled it. But behind the closed doors of Marjorie Nugent's mansion, the reality of the relationship was far from the fairy tale the town perceived. Marjorie's affection was a form of ownership. Her possessiveness, which had driven away her own family, was now focused entirely on Bernie. She demanded his constant, undivided attention. She monitored his every move, his every phone call. He was not allowed to have friends over. His time was not his own. The trips that seemed so glamorous were, according to Bernie, exercises in control and emotional abuse. Marjorie would berate him, belittle him, and dictate every aspect of his life. The man who was the toast of the town became a prisoner in a gilded cage. The pressure mounted. His friends in Carthage noticed a change in him. The ever-present smile seemed strained. He looked tired, worn down. He would complain discreetly about how demanding and difficult Mrs. Nugent was, how he felt trapped. He tried to distance himself, even enrolling in a business program in a nearby city, but Marjorie's demands only intensified. She would call him dozens of times a day, her voice a constant, nagging presence in his life. The man who had built his identity on being kind and accommodating was being systematically dismantled by the one person he was supposed to be helping. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, November 19th, 1996. The precise details of the argument are known only to Bernie, but it was the culmination of years of psychological pressure. They were in the garage of her home. Words were exchanged. Something inside Bernie, the part of him that had absorbed years of control and belittlement, finally snapped. He walked to a closet in the garage and retrieved a small .22 caliber rifle, a gun often used for target practice or killing pests, a varmint rifle. He returned to where Marjorie was standing, near the back of her car. With his back to her, she was reportedly berating him. He turned and fired. The bullet, small and seemingly insignificant, struck her 4 times in the back. Marjorie Nugent, the 81-year-old woman who was both his benefactor and his tormentor, fell to the garage floor, dead. There was no panic, no frantic call to the police. There was only the cold, methodical precision of a funeral director. Bernie wrapped her body in a white sheet. He then went to the kitchen and retrieved a large, deep chest freezer that had been used for storing corn and game. He placed Marjorie's body inside, closed the lid, and pushed the freezer back against the garage wall. He then went about cleaning the scene, removing any trace of what had just occurred. And then, Bernie Tito walked out of the garage and resumed his life. For the next 9 months, Bernie maintained the illusion that Marjorie Nugent was still alive. This was the beginning of the town's quiet complicity. When people asked where Marjorie was, Bernie had a ready-made story. Her health was failing. She was in a nursing home in a different city. She had had a stroke and couldn't speak or receive visitors. He was a master of deflecting inquiries with a sad smile and a concerned tone. And the people of Carthage, who adored Bernie and despised Marjorie, accepted his explanations without question. It was easier to believe Bernie than to imagine any alternative. No one wanted to bother the poor, difficult old woman. No one wanted to cause Bernie any more trouble. Her absence was, for many, a relief. During these 9 months, Bernie continued to spend her money, but in the eyes of the town, it was simply a continuation of his established generosity. He bought property, invested in local businesses, and continued to give lavishly to friends and community causes. He was still the beloved Bernie, now unburdened by the constant, visible presence of the unpleasant Mrs. Nugent. Life in Carthage was, in many ways, better. The secret began to unravel not from within the town, but from the outside. Marjorie's only son, Rod Nugent, a pathologist who lived in another city, had been estranged from his mother for years due to her difficult nature. But he grew increasingly suspicious when he was unable to reach her for months on end. Bernie's excuses became less and less plausible. Rod's sister, also suspicious, finally filed a missing person report. In August 1997, investigators arrived in Carthage. They questioned Bernie, who stuck to his story about Marjorie being in a nursing home. But when pressed for details, his story fell apart. The investigators, accompanied by Rod Nugent, obtained a warrant to search the house. On August 18, 1997, they opened the deep freezer in the garage. There, beneath bags of frozen corn and pecans, they found the sheet-wrapped body of Marjorie Nugent. The very next day, Bernie Tita was brought in for questioning. He did not resist. He did not lie. He immediately confessed to everything, calmly and factually recounting the years of pressure, the argument, the shooting, and the 9-month deception. The news of the murder and Bernie's confession sent a shockwave through Carthage. But the reaction was not what one might expect. There was no revulsion, no sense of betrayal. Instead, there was an immediate, overwhelming outpouring of support for the murderer. The town of Carthage rallied around Bernie Tita. "Free Bernie" signs began to appear. Friends and neighbors organized to raise money for his legal defense. The prevailing sentiment in town was not that Bernie had committed a heinous crime, but that he had finally been pushed too far by a horrible woman. He was seen as the true victim. In the coffee shops and church pews of Carthage, Marjorie Nugent was effectively put on trial and convicted posthumously. People openly said that he only killed her once. She was killing him every day, or more bluntly, she had it coming. The murder was seen as an act of liberation, not just for Bernie, but for the whole town, which had been vicariously freed from her negative aura. The case fell to the local district attorney, Danny Buck Davidson. Davidson was a friend of Bernie's. He had received gifts from Bernie. He understood the town's sentiment better than anyone. He quickly realized that he could never get a fair trial in Panola County. A jury of Carthage citizens would almost certainly refuse to convict the man they loved for killing the woman they hated. In a stunning reversal of legal norms, the prosecution, not the defense, filed for a change of venue. They argued that they could not get an impartial jury one that would be willing to convict Bernie. The trial was moved 50 miles away to the town of San Augustine. Despite the change of venue, dozens of Carthage residents made the journey every day to sit in the courtroom in a silent show of support for Bernie. They glared at the prosecutor and at Rod Nugent. Bernie's defense argued that he was in a dissociative state at the time of the killing, a temporary break from reality brought on by years of psychological abuse. The prosecution painted a different picture, that of a calculating manipulator who killed Marjorie for her money and then coolly covered it up for nearly a year. The jury in San Augustine, free from the emotional influence of Carthage, saw it the prosecution's way. They found Bernie Tita guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The story, however, did not end there. The town of Carthage never abandoned him. They wrote him letters, sent him money, and continued to advocate for his release. Years later, the case attracted the attention of Austin-based filmmaker Richard Linklater, who was fascinated by the town's bizarre loyalty. His 2011 film, Bernie, starring Jack Black, brought the strange tale to a national audience. The film's portrayal, sympathetic to Bernie, led an attorney to re-examine the case. New evidence emerged suggesting Bernie had been a victim of childhood sexual abuse, which a psychologist argued made him psychologically susceptible to Marjorie's control and contributed to the snap. In a highly unusual move, District Attorney Danny Buck Davidson supported Bernie's release. He stated that he now believed Bernie deserved a lesser sentence and that if he had known about the prior abuse, he would have argued for it at the original trial. In 2014, Bernie Tita was released from prison on bond, on the condition that he live in the garage apartment of filmmaker Richard Linklater in Austin. But the Nugent family fought back. They argued that justice had not been served, that a convicted murderer was being freed because he was charming and well-liked. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals agreed. In 2016, after a new sentencing hearing where the jury once again heard all the evidence, Bernie Tita was resentenced, this time to 99 years to life. He was returned to prison, where he remains today. The case of Bernie Tita and Marjorie Nugent is a profound and unsettling meditation on the nature of justice and sympathy. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Does a person's character and contribution to a community mitigate the crime of murder? Can a victim be so unpleasant that their death warrants not condemnation, but quiet approval? The people of Carthage made their choice. They valued the life of the man who brought them joy over the life of the woman who brought only misery. Their secret was not one of shared guilt, but of shared affectionate love so powerful it was willing to forgive the unforgivable, and in doing so, became a silent accomplice to the crime itself. Case 3. The Poison in the Practice. A lethal secret festering within the close-knit, trusted confines of a family-run business. We now move from the open, sun-drenched plains of Texas to the dense, shadowed woods of northeastern Pennsylvania. Our destination is Montrose, a small county seat where the sense of community is as deeply rooted as the ancient trees that line its quiet streets. In such a place, the family doctor is more than a medical professional. He is a confidant, a pillar of stability, a keeper of the town's most personal stories. This is a story about the ultimate violation of that trust. It is about a secret that was not shouted from the rooftops or hidden by collective action, but one that festered quietly, like a sickness, within the very heart of the town's most trusted institution, the family medical practice. Dr. David Stevens was the platonic ideal of a small-town doctor. Kind, patient, and deeply dedicated, he had served the community of Montrose for decades. His practice was a cornerstone of the town, a place where generations of families had brought their fevers, their fears, and their newborns. Dr. Stevens was a part of the fabric of their lives. In the early 1970s, it seemed the future of this trusted legacy was secure. His daughter, Patricia, known as Patty, had married a charismatic and ambitious young man named Stephen Schurz. Schurz, like Bernie Tita, was a man who seemed almost too good to be true. He was handsome, intelligent, and possessed an easy charm that won people over instantly. He was also a doctor, a podiatrist. After marrying Patty, he joined his father-in-law's practice. To the people of Montrose, it was a perfect succession. The beloved Dr. Stevens was grooming his own son-in-law to one day take the reins, ensuring that the health of the community would remain in trusted, familial hands. The practice was a symbol of continuity, of a bond that went beyond medicine. It was a family taking care of the town's families. Behind this idyllic facade, however, a complex and toxic web of relationships was being woven. Stephen Schurz's ambition was not matched by his fidelity. He began an affair with a woman named Patricia Putnam, the wife of a local contractor. In a town as small as Montrose, such secrets rarely stay buried for long. Whispers began to circulate, tarnishing Schurz's golden boy image. But this was only the most visible layer of his deception. A darker, more shocking rumor also began to take hold, one that seemed almost unthinkable. People began to whisper that Stephen Schurz was also involved with his wife's younger sister, Charlene. The betrayal was not just of his wife, but of the entire family structure that had welcomed him. But the deepest and most poisonous secret of all was festering right inside the medical practice itself. Schurz, it was rumored, had begun an affair with his mother-in-law, Dr. Stevens's wife, a nurse in the practice who was also, confusingly, named Patricia. This was the ultimate transgression, a betrayal of such profound magnitude that it defied comprehension. It transformed the family practice from a sanctuary of healing into a theater of sordid secrets, all revolving around the charming Dr. Schurz. This was the volatile, hidden reality on the morning of December 27, 1976. It was the day after Christmas, and the woods around Montrose were blanketed in a cold, stark winter silence. Dr. Stevens and Stephen Schurz, the father and son-in-law, went skeet shooting together in a remote, wooded area known as Tannery Swamp. It was a typical pastime for men in the region. Hours later, a frantic Stephen Schurz ran to a nearby farmhouse, his story tumbling out in a rush of panic. There had been a terrible accident, he said. He had been walking, tripped over a wire or a root, and fell. As he fell, his 12-gauge shotgun had accidentally discharged, hitting his father-in-law. It was a tragic freak accident. When police and paramedics arrived at the scene, they found Dr. David Stevens lying dead in the snow. He had been shot once in the chest. Stephen Schurz was distraught, reenacting his fall for the officers, pointing out the wire he claimed to have tripped on. On the surface, it seemed like a plausible, if heartbreaking, tragedy. Hunting accidents, while not common, were certainly not unheard of. The initial finding by the county coroner was accidental death. The town of Montrose plunged into mourning for its beloved doctor. But almost immediately, the official story felt wrong to those who knew the family and the whispers that surrounded them. The town's grief was quickly tinged with a deep, unspoken suspicion. The accident seemed far too convenient. Schurz stood to inherit the practice. He was entangled in multiple affairs, one of which was with the victim's own wife. A motive, ugly and undeniable, hung in the air. The whispers that had been circulating for months grew louder, more insistent. People started talking. They noted how Schurz, at the funeral, seemed more concerned with comforting his mother-in-law, Patricia Stevens, than his own grieving wife. Their body language seemed too intimate, too familiar for a son-in-law and his mourning mother-in-law. The police, too, had their doubts. The scene of the accident didn't quite add up. Schurz claimed to have fallen forward, yet the fatal shot had entered Dr. Stevens's chest from a distance, not at close range as one would expect from such a fall. The pattern of the shotgun pellets suggested a range of about 15 feet. Furthermore, Schurz's hunting clothes were remarkably clean for a man who had supposedly taken a hard fall in the muddy, snowy terrain. And then there was the gun. It was a pump-action shotgun, a type of firearm that requires a specific, deliberate action to chamber a round and is not notoriously prone to accidental discharge from a simple fall. The investigation, led by a persistent state trooper named Joseph Vanuga, began to slowly peel back the layers of Schurz's story. Vanuga was an outsider to the town's social dynamics, which allowed him to view the case with a clinical objectivity that the locals lacked. He started interviewing people, and the rumors of the affairs were quickly confirmed. He learned of Schurz's ambition, his desire to be the sole head of the practice. A picture emerged of a man who wanted his father-in-law's life, his practice, his wife, his status, and was willing to do anything to get it. Schurz's story began to change under scrutiny. He gave multiple, conflicting accounts of how he fell and where he was in relation to Dr. Stevens when the gun went off. His credibility crumbled with each retelling. The most damning piece of evidence, however, came from the pathologist. The autopsy revealed that the shot had traveled through Dr. Stevens's body at a downward angle. For this to have happened, as Schurz described, with him falling on the ground and Stevens standing, was a physical impossibility. The laws of physics themselves were a silent witness against him. The only way the wound could have been inflicted was if the shooter was standing above the victim. This forensic evidence, combined with the swirling rumors and Schurz's inconsistent statements, was enough for authorities to act. They felt they had a strong circumstantial case for murder. But, to be certain, they needed to take a drastic step. In March 1977, nearly 3 months after his death, the body of Dr. David Stevens was exhumed from its grave. A second, more thorough autopsy was performed by a forensic pathologist. The findings were conclusive. The wound was not consistent with an accidental shooting as described by Stephen Schurz. It was a homicide. In February 1978, more than a year after the shooting, Stephen Schurz was arrested and charged with the murder of his father-in-law. The town's secret was now an open accusation. The trial was a sensation in the small community. The prosecution laid out its case meticulously. They presented the forensic evidence, the shot distance, the downward angle. They called witnesses who testified about the affairs, painting a picture of Schurz as a manipulative philanderer with a powerful motive. The defense maintained that it was a tragic accident, that the prosecution's case was built on nothing more than salacious rumor and innuendo. But the jury, composed of citizens from the very region Schurz had tried to deceive, saw through the charm. They weighed the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the undeniable motive. They convicted Stephen Schurz of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. For the town of Montrose and the family of Dr. Stevens, it seemed that justice, though delayed, had finally been served. The truth that had been whispered in private had been affirmed in a court of law. But the story was far from over. Schurz, ever persistent, began a long and arduous appeals process from his prison cell. In a stunning turn of events, in 1980, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction. The reason was not a lack of evidence, but a technicality. The trial judge had improperly instructed the jury, telling them that if they did not believe Schurz's version of events, they could infer that the opposite was true. This was deemed a violation of his rights. The conviction was thrown out, and a new trial was ordered. However, the key witness for the prosecution, the state trooper Joseph Fanuga, had tragically died of a heart attack shortly after the first trial. Key evidence had been lost. The district attorney's office, believing they no longer had enough to secure a conviction, made a difficult decision. They dropped the charges. In 1981, Stephen Schurz walked out of prison a free man. He did not return to Montrose. He moved to the American South and later to North Carolina, where he remarried and attempted to build a new life under a new name, changing it to Dr. Stephen Lathrop. He managed to escape the shadow of the accusations that had defined his past. But in Montrose, he was never free. The case became a ghost that haunted the community. For nearly 2 decades, the town lived with the unsettling knowledge that the man they believed had murdered their beloved doctor was living free, unpunished. The secret had not been resolved. It had simply been buried by a legal technicality. Dr. Stevens's death remained an open wound, a constant, painful reminder of a profound betrayal and a justice system that had failed them. His daughters, Patty and Charlene, were left in an impossible position, torn between their father's memory and the man who had been, at different times, a husband and a lover to them both. The case lay dormant for years, a cold file in a dusty cabinet. But some, including Dr. Stevens's family and the new generation of law enforcement, never gave up. In the mid-1990s, armed with advances in forensic science and a renewed determination, the Pennsylvania State Police and the District Attorney's Office decided to reopen the case. They painstakingly re-interviewed witnesses and re-examined the old evidence. They found that despite the passage of time, the core of the case against Schurz remained solid. In 1997, 20 years after the death of Dr. David Stevens, a warrant was issued for the arrest of the man now known as Stephen Lathrop. He was located in North Carolina and extradited back to Pennsylvania to stand trial for a second time. The 1997 trial was a journey back in time. Witnesses, now 2 decades older, took the stand to recount the events of 1976. The courtroom was once again filled with the sordid details of the affairs, the ambition, and the lies. The defense again argued it was an accident. But the prosecution presented a powerful new piece of evidence, a 3D computer animation that visually demonstrated how Schurz's version of the fall was physically impossible, while showing how a deliberate, standing shot perfectly matched the victim's wounds. This time, there would be no technicalities, no escape. The jury, after deliberating for just a few hours, found Stephen Schurz guilty of first-degree murder for a second time. Justice, which had been dormant for 2 decades, had finally reawakened. Stephen Schurz was sentenced, once again, to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story of the Montrose medical practice is a chilling illustration of how the most monstrous secrets can be hidden not in the shadows, but in the most trusted corners of our lives. The practice was supposed to be a place of care and trust, a family legacy. But it became the incubator for a poison of infidelity and greed that grew until it turned lethal. The town of Montrose knew. They felt the wrongness of it in their bones long before the law could prove it. Their secret was a burden of knowledge, a quiet, collective understanding that the man entrusted with their health was a man who had stolen the life of his mentor and benefactor. It is a story that reminds us that the deepest betrayals are often committed by those we welcome closest into our homes and our hearts. Case 4. The Ghost of Baldwin County. A 2-decade-long whisper that named the killers of a vanished man long before justice ever could. Our final file takes us to the humid, moss-draped landscape of northern Florida, to a place where land and water merge in a labyrinth of lakes and swamps. This is a story about a disappearance, a lie that was almost swallowed whole by the wild, and a secret that refused to be digested. It is the story of a ghost not of a man, but of a truth that haunted a community for nearly 2 decades, a persistent whisper that named the killers long before the law was ever willing to listen. Michael "Mike" Williams was a man who had mastered his environment. He was a successful real estate appraiser, a devoted husband to his high school sweetheart, Denise, and a doting father to their young daughter. He was at home in the wilderness of the Florida Panhandle, an avid and experienced duck hunter. His life, by all accounts, was one of promise and stability. His best friend since childhood was a man named Brian Winchester, who worked in financial planning. The 2 men, along with their wives, were inextricably linked, a tight-knit foursome navigating early adulthood together. On the morning of December 16, 2000, just before his 6th wedding anniversary, Mike Williams kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and drove his Ford Bronco to Lake Seminole, a vast, alligator-infested body of water on the Florida-Georgia border. He was going on a solo duck hunting trip, a common excursion for him. He promised to be back by noon. Noon came and went. As afternoon bled into evening, Denise Williams began to worry. She called Brian Winchester, her husband's best friend. Together, they drove to the remote boat launch where Mike would have parked. They found his Bronco, the boat trailer still attached. But Mike and his boat were gone. A search was immediately launched. The search was extensive, involving law enforcement and volunteers from multiple agencies. That night, they found Mike's boat, seemingly abandoned, miles from the launch. The next day, they found more, his hunting jacket, his waders, and his hunting license, all floating in the water. But of Mike Williams, there was no sign. The search went on for days, covering a massive area of the lake, but it yielded nothing more. The authorities, faced with a missing man in a lake teeming with some of the largest alligators in the state, quickly settled on a chilling and seemingly plausible theory. Mike Williams, they concluded, must have fallen out of his boat, gotten tangled in the vegetation in his heavy waders, and been dragged under and consumed by alligators. The official search was called off after 44 days. A judge declared Mike Williams legally dead, citing accidental drowning. The case was closed. To the outside world, it was a tragic story of a man claimed by the savage nature he loved. But within the community, and especially among those who knew Mike Williams and the lake, the official story never felt right. It was a lie, a story too clean and too convenient, and it began to fray at the edges almost immediately. The whispers started in the bait shops, the diners, and the church pews. Seasoned hunters and fishermen knew things. They knew that alligators in December are largely dormant, their metabolism slowed by the colder water. A feeding frenzy was highly unlikely. They knew that if a gator had attacked him, the scene would have been violent and bloody, yet the boat was undisturbed. Most critically, they knew that waders, the very things meant to have dragged him down, are designed with air pockets and would have likely floated, not sunk. The idea that his body had been so completely consumed that not a single bone fragment, a scrap of clothing, or a tooth remained was, to them, preposterous. The community's suspicions soon found a focus. It settled on the two people closest to Mike, his widow, Denise, and his best friend, Brian Winchester. Their behavior in the aftermath of the disappearance struck many as odd. Brian had been the one to discover the abandoned boat. Denise, just 6 months after her husband was declared dead, collected on 3 separate life insurance policies. 2 of those policies had been sold to Mike by Brian Winchester himself. The total payout was a staggering $1.75 million. The motive, cold and hard and green, was now sitting in a bank account. The whispers grew louder as the community watched the story they had suspected play out in real time. The grieving widow and the supportive best friend grew closer. They began dating. 5 years after Mike Williams vanished, Denise Williams and Brian Winchester were married. They built a new life together on the foundation of Mike's death, living in the same community, a constant, walking embodiment of the town's darkest suspicions. But one person's voice rose above the whispers. It was a voice that refused to accept the lie, that refused to be silenced. It belonged to Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams. From the moment the official story was presented, Cheryl knew in her soul that it was wrong. She knew her son was a cautious and experienced outdoorsman. She knew the alligator story was a fabrication designed to close a book that should have remained open. Cheryl Williams transformed from a grieving mother into a relentless, one-woman investigative force. She became the keeper of the secret, the ghost of the truth that haunted the authorities. She wrote thousands of letters to the local sheriff, to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, FDLE, to the governor, to any official who would listen, begging them to reopen the case as a homicide investigation. She took out ads in the local newspaper, offering a reward for information. She stood on street corners with signs. She contacted wildlife experts who confirmed her suspicions about alligator behavior. She was dismissed as a hysterical mother, unable to accept a tragic accident. But she persisted. For 17 years, she was a constant, nagging presence, refusing to let her son be forgotten, refusing to let the town's secret die. She believed, with every fiber of her being, that her son had been murdered, and she was certain she knew who did it. The years rolled on. The case grew colder. Denise and Brian Winchester lived their lives. They raised Mike's daughter as their own. To many, it seemed the perfect crime had been committed. The secret of what really happened at Lake Seminole was protected by the official record, by the passage of time, and by the impenetrable silence of the 2 people who held the truth. But secrets, like poison, have a way of corroding the containers that hold them. The marriage built on a lie began to crumble. By 2012, Brian and Denise's relationship had deteriorated. They separated. Their divorce proceedings grew increasingly bitter and contentious. Brian, it seemed, began to fear that Denise, in her anger, might finally break her silence. He grew paranoid, erratic. The man who had helped craft a perfect crime was losing control. The breaking point, the event that would finally shatter the 16-year-old secret, came on August 5, 2016. Denise, on her way to work, was stopped at a traffic light. A figure emerged from the back of her car, where he had been hiding. It was Brian Winchester, and he was holding a gun. He told her he was taking her to a remote location to talk, to sort things out. He claimed he didn't want a divorce. Denise, terrified but thinking fast, managed to talk him down. She promised him whatever he wanted, pleaded for her life. After a harrowing standoff in a parking lot, he let her go. She drove immediately to the police. Brian Winchester was arrested and charged with the armed kidnapping of his wife. He was facing a mandatory sentence of life in prison. He was trapped. The life he had built, the freedom he had enjoyed for 16 years, was over. He had only one thing left to bargain with: the truth. Faced with spending the rest of his life behind bars for kidnapping, Winchester made a deal. He would confess to everything he knew about the disappearance of Mike Williams. In exchange, he would receive total immunity from prosecution for the murder. The authorities, who had been stonewalled for nearly 2 decades, agreed. The ghost that Cheryl Williams had kept alive was finally about to speak. Winchester's confession was chilling in its cold, calculated detail. It was exactly what the town had whispered all along. He confirmed that he and Denise had been having an affair for years before Mike's death. They wanted to be together, but a divorce would have been messy and financially devastating. So they hatched a plan. The $1.75 million in life insurance was not a coincidence. It was the motive. He described the morning of December 16, 2000. He had convinced Mike to go duck hunting, promising him a great spot. Out on the vast, empty expanse of Lake Seminole, Brian Winchester asked Mike to stand up. As Mike did, Winchester pushed him overboard. His initial plan was to have it look like a simple drowning, but Mike, a strong swimmer, managed to cling to a tree stump, struggling to stay afloat in the cold water. He cried out for help to the man he thought was his best friend. Panicked that his plan was failing, Winchester circled the boat around. He retrieved his 12-gauge shotgun. He pointed it at his friend's face and pulled the trigger. He then loaded Mike's body into the boat, drove to a secluded cove on the shore, and buried him in a deep, muddy grave he had prepared in advance. He then drove the boat to another part of the lake, dumped Mike's gear in the water to create the scene of an accident, and went to meet Denise to report Mike missing. The alligator story was a deliberate lie, a red herring they concocted to mislead everyone. As part of his deal, Winchester had to lead investigators to the body. In December 2017, almost exactly 17 years after Mike vanished, investigators dug at the spot Winchester indicated, near the end of a dead-end road. They found a skeleton. Dental records confirmed it was Mike Williams. The town's secret was no longer a whisper. It was a physical reality, unearthed from the cold Florida mud. With Winchester's confession and the recovery of the body, the authorities finally had what they needed. Their focus turned to the only other person who knew the secret, Denise Williams. In May 2018, she was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. The trial of Denise Williams began in December 2018. The star witness for the prosecution was her ex-husband and co-conspirator, Brian Winchester. The courtroom watched, mesmerized, as the man who pulled the trigger calmly and methodically detailed the plot he had hatched with the woman sitting at the defense table. For 17 years, the town had known the story. Now they were hearing it, word for word, from the killer himself. Denise's defense team tried to paint Winchester as a lone wolf killer and a liar who was implicating Denise to save himself. But the prosecution's case, built on years of financial records, cell phone data, and Winchester's damning testimony, was overwhelming. After 8 days of testimony, The jury took just 8 hours to find Anise Williams guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison. In the end, The Secret of Baldwin County was not a story of a community protecting a killer. It was the story of a community that held on to a truth the system refused to acknowledge. It was a secret kept alive by a mother's unwavering love and a town's collective, correct intuition. The ghost that haunted them was the specter of an injustice that was allowed to stand for far too long. The final verdict was more than a legal conclusion. It was a validation of a 2-decade-long whisper, a final, quiet affirmation that in a small town, some truths, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find their way to the surface. And so, our folio closes for tonight. We have walked the quiet streets of 4 towns, each bound by a secret held for different reasons. We have seen a silence born of collective fear, another woven from misguided love, and others that festered in the heart of trust itself. In these close-knit places, a terrible act is never a self-contained event. It seeps into the soil, becoming a part of the town's very identitia, permanent ghost in the collective memory. The truth, as we have seen, possesses a strange gravity, even when buried for decades under a wall of complicity. It is a weight that erodes the strongest packs, a story kept from being lost forever only by the persistence of a solitary voice refusing to be silenced. These secrets leave indelible marks, not as loud, open wounds, but as quiet, settled scars. They are cautionary tales carried on the night air, reminders of the darkness that can lurk beneath the most tranquil surfaces and of the profound, often tragic, choices people make to protect a small town's secret.